Very good morning. How's everyone today? I would encourage those of you that are sitting more in the back to maybe, we're a smallish group right now, but maybe you'll want to come up. Yeah, Paul, good example. Front seat for you. Yay! All right. Okay, so I'm Cindy Mamacini. I'm representing the South Asia Department, but I'm here just as your moderator today for this incredibly exciting, groundbreaking kind of topic of natural capital accounting. So we're incredibly privileged to have a speaker from the U.S., Professor Eli Fenichel from Yale University. And he has been renowned for some groundbreaking work in how to view natural resources as a crucial form of capital in and of itself, on par with produced capital. His research emphasizes economic valuation of natural capital that can be used in cost-benefit analysis and national accounting systems. So he's going to tell us a lot today also about a development of a new framework that the United States has been using in its ambitious 15-year program that seeks to establish natural capital accounts and environmental economic statistics. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Eli to the stage. Then we're going to have discussion and also engagement with you about how this might apply in Asia and the Pacific. Dr. Eli, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Cindy. Great. Does this work? No. Do I have slides? All right. They needed to start it for me. We had it, and now we don't. All right. Well, thank you all for having me here. Hopefully the slides will come up in a minute. So I will go ahead and start so we can hear from other people besides just me. Hopefully we'll get slides. So the topic today, the title is, okay, can we get to slide one? I cannot get back to slide one. There we go. Wonderful. Okay, here's our topic. EcoMetrics, Unveiling the Economic Power of Nature. And so I had help coming up with this title, so I figured I might as well continue getting help. So I asked one of the AI image generators to tell us what this looks like, to give you all an image to start with here. So that's what the image you're seeing is. But what we should really start with is probably this image that I think people have seen before, where this idea that the economy is nested inside society, is nested inside environment, is trying to convince us that the economy is dependent on nature, is dependent on the environment. This is not a new idea. We can go back over 100 years to economists like Irving Fisher. In his seminal 1906 book, The Nature of Capital Income, he starts describing what is wealth. And the first example he uses is Newfoundland fish stocks. I gave a similar talk, sort of on this topic a couple months ago, and was visiting the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. What's interesting is it's a big agriculture school in a big agricultural area of the United States. They built their agriculture building in 1901, and on their agriculture building in 1901, they wrote, "The wealth of Illinois is in her soil." So clearly we've been thinking that natural resources are a form of capital, an asset, for a very long time. So I actually kind of take issue with this figure that's become very popular, because the idea that the economy is simply contained within inside the environment so that we can ignore the environment and deal with just the economy is a bit misleading. This is the image that I'd like you to keep in your mind, which is an economy and an environment that are so interwoven that it's hard to tell where one starts and the other stops. And this becomes really important when we start thinking about how we measure the economy itself, and what does that even mean? So what is the economy? What are we actually talking about here? We can think about various sectors, whether it's agriculture. We've been talking about agriculture a lot this week. Industry, natural resource extractive industries, services, etc. And what we do is we tend to measure the economy with statistics. And the headline statistic many of us are familiar with is gross domestic product, or GDP. That helps us weave the sort of social narrative. It helps us tell our stories about the economy. But it turns out we didn't actually talk about the economy until we had the statistic, or at least we didn't capitalize the economy. We didn't use the term the economy. We didn't actually have a term for it. Instead, what we did is looked at things like rail car loadings and whatnot. And so we've migrated from looking at a smattering of different statistics and indicators to trying to have an organized system with a headline. Right? This sound familiar? Because I think we're still in this sort of scattering of statistics when it comes to the environment, climate change, natural resources. Next slide, please. Maybe that works. Okay. Whoa. Okay, here we go. We're working again. All right. So a common saying about GDP is that it gives a bird's eye view of the economy. And I like to say it gives exactly a one-eyed bird's view. So if you think about a blind bird, it crashes into everything, and that's kind of, think 1920s, Great Depression era economics. We had this crazy amount of statistics, but we didn't really know how to get a clear view of the whole thing. And so what we did is we took one cover off the bird. If you know much about birds, they like to fly, right? We know that. And if you're trying to fly around the room, try walking around a room with a lot of objects with one eye closed, and you kind of lose your depth perception. Well, that's where our bird that is the economy is today. So we know that people care about consumption. Consumption is very important. And how do we get consumption? We make stuff. How do we make stuff? We use labor. We use stuff we've made before. We call the stuff we've made before capital. And what GDP tries to do is create this bottleneck statistic here in the middle. You guys can't see that green light, so I'm not going to use it. And what's nice about that is it gives us this overall narrative, but it also provides a lot of organized data to help us think about things like tax bases, productivity, creditworthiness. It often gets used to think about development status and progress. Whether that's right or wrong, we can have a discussion. There's two long-running critiques of sort of gross production accounting, whether it's gross national product or gross domestic product. Don't worry about the difference. One is associated with, I like this quote from Robert Kennedy to describe it, which is, gross national product measures everything in short except that which makes life worthwhile. And what he's complaining about here is, what is the accounting boundary? What do we include in our boundary of what is the economy, given that how we define the economy is what's in GDP, right? So we sort of have this bit of circular logic where we've wrapped something up about what's in and what's out, and so we're worried about that. Another critique I associate with Sir Partha Dasgupta, and this has to do with the fact that we're talking about gross rather than net. And he says GDP measures growth like a football team, which measures its success only on the basis of goals it scores and doesn't count the goals it concedes. That football team could be losing right through without even realizing it, right? And so the problem here with gross domestic product is that we can boost gross domestic product by pulling down capital, by taking on additional unaccounted for debt. These are ways that we can simply boost GDP in the short run. And when we inherit capital, when it comes as an endowment, which is how we've received a lot of our natural capital, rather than having to pay for it in the first place, we have a hard time accounting for it. What we can do is we can expand this system to give our bird two eyes. We can get a clearer view of what we might think of as the economy today, particularly an economy that is impacted by climate change, by pollution, by biodiversity loss. And we can expand our notions of capital, and we can differentiate them into natural capital, covering things like climate, environment, nature, and human capital, which is also incredibly important, where we think about health and education and investing in people, all very important for development. And we can expand our view of what might actually count for people. And this gives us just a richer view of what's going on. Okay, I'm going to focus on natural capital today. I do not want to minimize the importance of human capital, but you've only given me about 30 more minutes to talk, and I want to stay on schedule. So most of us here are interested in the notion of sustainable development, and most of us are familiar with the Brundtland definition of meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. What's really interesting is, for the economists in the room, this is really a social version of Hicks's income concept, right? And so in 1939, Sir John Hicks says that, well, what is income? Income is what we can consume today without reducing consumption in the future. Sounds pretty similar. And so in order to get that, we've had to develop new systems of accounting to expand our system of national accounts. And one of the expansions has been to think about a system of environmental economic accounting, which is a daughter standard to our system of national account standard for how we compile these statistics that help us tell the story about the economy and help us make economic decisions. And we've seen growing support for this, UN, WEF, Network for Greening the Financial System, G7, G20, Global Biodiversity Framework. The list goes on and on where we're looking for this information. But where are we today? So I had one of my students go to the old portal that the OECD has. They tried to come up with a new data portal, which is actually a lot harder to get to the underlying data progress. And so it turns out our old system our standard system of national accounts, nothing fancy about the environment here, has the income account and sort of the production and income accounts that people are probably more familiar with. This is what gets summarized into GDP. It also has a balance sheet, which is supposed to balance, right, or double entry accounting. Since 1993, that balance sheet has been broken into two sections, a financial section and a non-financial section. Non-financial are real assets. These include things like buildings and infrastructure. Okay? That gets further broken down into produced and non-produced assets. This list here on the left is just blown up so you guys can read it a little bit better. All of these things, many people will consider natural capital. Cultivated biological resources, these things are like orchards, okay? Plantation forests. And they've already supposed to be in the balance sheet, and they're considered produced assets. Mineral exploration and evaluation is considered a produced asset. Everything else up here, land, natural resources, non-cultivated biological assets like fisheries, fish stocks and wild forests, water resources, and then there's a space for other natural resources. All of these have been supposed to be included on national balance sheets going back to 1993. This is a list of OECD countries that report to the OECD, and what they actually compile and what they actually report to the OECD. So Australia reports across the board. We see Mexico, Canada, Czech Republic, Japan, and France with a lot of coverage, followed by South Korea, but then it tails off pretty quickly. The US we see down here finally getting onto the board about 2 years ago. This is, I think, 2021 or 2022 data, and had a partial land account. And there's 5 more countries that actually report doing absolutely nothing. That is the system of national accounts. The system of environmental economic accounting, which we can think of as a daughter standard of the system of national accounts, the UN Statistics Division did an assessment. They actually just put out their 2023 assessment, I think, last week, and I haven't had a chance to look at it. But their 2022 assessment, they say that about 90 countries are compiling some element of the system of environmental economic accounting. However, if you start digging into what's there, what you see is they only provide links for about 70 countries. Of those, most of the links are broken, and you can reconstruct some of those links if you work hard. And what you find when you do that is most countries that are participating in this aren't really producing environmental economic accounting. What they're doing is starting to compile the environmental data in an accounting structure that could be potentially linked to economic accounts going forward. So there's still a lot of real work to do on the ground, even though we've been talking about this for a while. There's a lot of opportunity, but there is work. So so I've put up a smattering of countries that are working. The Philippines has some environmental economic statistics developed. Australia, as I noted before, Indonesia's been a leader in conversations and trying to do things. Canada, Chile, I think people are familiar with the Descripta review, but the UK has been doing a lot of natural capital accounting for a while, and the US finally has its strategy. The other exciting thing that's happening right now is the system of national accounts is being revised for release in 2025. There's going to be a new chapter, I think it's chapter 2, on national accounting for well-being and environmental sustainability. And there's a lot of discussion about how natural capital could be better used. It's not changing the boundaries, but it's saying we already have a lot of stuff in our boundaries. How should we be using it? And how to think beyond just a GDP as a summary statistic. There's also a chapter, I believe it's going to be chapter 35, on measuring well-being and development, which involves natural capital and human capital. And that's about to go out for public consultation. So if this is something that you're interested in, I would encourage you to watch for this and provide feedback to the editors who are having to assemble this. This is a link to the US strategy if people are interested in having a look. If you haven't seen it, I think everyone in here is used to writing for policymakers, so this is 100 pages of bullet points, because that's all federal officials would let you write. I think that's true of most countries. It's pretty easy to read, and I think there's a lot of good information that goes beyond just what's important to the US. So when I give talks like this in the US, people love this slide. I don't know how much you guys will all love it, but I figured since everybody loves it, I should present it, which is kind of the history of how the US got to finally having a strategy last year. So we can go back again to Irving Fisher, who I introduced earlier in the talk. He was actually a Yale professor at the turn of the 20th century. And in his book, you see him writing things like, it would be wrong, however, that because we cannot value them accurately, public parks, natural capital, and free men, human capital, cannot be called wealth. Right? So this is laying out, and so if you were a PhD student, you probably had to prove the separating hyperplanes theorem in your graduate school at some point. If you're an econ PhD student, that's Fisher, right? Same Irving Fisher. Irving Fisher was at Yale the same time this guy Gifford Pinchot was at Yale. Gifford Pinchot founded the US Forest Service. He also founded my school, which is the School of the Environment. It was called the School of Forests then. Both of these men were on boards together. They were both advisors to the US President Teddy Roosevelt. And Roosevelt famously says, the nation behaves well if it treats natural resources as assets, which it must turn over to the next generation increased and not impaired in value. And I've had economists go, oh, did he mean that figuratively or did he mean that literally? And if you go back and read what Pinchot was writing, and if you read what Fisher was writing, he meant that literally. These guys were very much saying that our natural resources are assets and we need to manage them just like we would any other financial asset of the country. So I'm going to skip most of the 20th century, or at least the first half. Some interesting things happen, like Bretton Woods, like the development of GDP, like the development of national accounts. The word environment enters the English language as late as 1948. So the word environment wasn't actually used, the first use of environment in the ecological sense that we use it today comes after we developed national accounts in 1942. Okay, so some cool stuff's happening. But in 1972, 73, Bill Nordhaus and James Tobin write this paper called Is Growth Obsolete? And Bill tells the story that he was actually responding to a newspaper article written by a young radical who wrote, take your GNP and stuff it. To me, it stands for gross national pollution. And Bill goes, is that right? So Bill is a very thoughtful man. And the problem, of course, is that there is no pollution in GNP. That's actually exactly wrong. It's that we are not accounting for these things. So they conclude in this paper that there are serious consequences to treating as free things which are not really free. And what they mean by free are things left out of the accounts. This gives the wrong signals for the direction of economic growth. This paper is followed by a whole bunch of work by Jeff Heel, Sir Partha Dasgupta, Ken Arrow, Robert Solow, and others really developing the modern theory of the economics of sustainable development. And then by the early 90s, the system of national accounts has adopted those sort of headline levels of natural capital that I showed you a moment ago, and the US Bureau of Economic Analysis is initiating environmental economic satellite accounts. Unfortunately, in 1994, the US Congress decided they should go and have to do a peer review, and they should pause that work until they get a peer review done, and they gave them some money to go get a peer review. That peer review became Bill Nordhaus's Nature's Numbers book. That's actually where that book comes from. It is the peer review of BEA's work. What's fascinating is that between the time it took them to tell BEA to stop and Nordhaus publishes this, the US Congress actually overhauls the US statistical system, which is a mess, by the way. We have 13 principal statistical agencies and over 100 different statistical offices in the United States. So it's actually a big coordination challenge to do much of anything. But it establishes the modern office in 1995 with our famous Paperwork Reduction Act, which everyone likes to make fun of, the name of this thing. But it overhauls the statistical system. It establishes the modern office of the US Chief Statistician and the Office of Management and Budget, and it gives her the authority to basically do most of what BEA was doing, or to organize BEA into that sort of structure. We then see in the early 2000s a series of reports coming out of the US, and I'll focus on those from the National Research Council, from the National Bureau of Economic Research, from the US Government Accountability Office, all saying there's a need for some form of environmental economic statistics that actually talk to the economic data. Okay? The big debate is not about to have the underlying statistics, it's about how to summarize them at this point in time. By 2012, and so during this time, the World Bank is starting its Changing Wealth of Nations work. The adjusted net savings work is going on. So we're starting to see this these statistics get compiled. And by 2012, lots of countries are starting to implement this new thing called the SIA Central Framework. And then it's actually not until 2019 that the US Congress passes the Evidence-Based Policymaking Act. And this is the first time that the Congress of the United States has actually instructed the statistical community in the US to produce statistics related to the natural environment. So this is part of what lays this long groundwork for the current US strategy. That strategy is organized into 5 areas. These are our recommendation. These are called recommendations in the strategy. And some bits are going to be more interesting to you all than others. The first bit is about how would you actually use this system? Why is it important? The second bit is where does the US see its role in the world? I will leave that to all of you to imagine how the US likes to see its role in the world. The third bit is sort of gives some high-level principles, and it's really this 3B that I'll spend some time talking about, which is accounting boundaries in a moment. It goes through a 15-year phased plan, and so the goal of this US strategy is not to produce research, it's not to produce an experiment, it is to produce official US statistics. So if you've ever seen somebody speak from the US government, particularly researchers, they always have a disclaimer that says, I'm not speaking for the US government, these are my research results. The point here is that there will be US officials will be able to stand up without that disclaimer and have official environmental economic statistics to cite, just like they could cite official GDP. And then there's some bits that relate specifically to how to administer this thing in the US. Accounting boundaries are really important, and this is where a lot of the debate on valuation actually lies. This is that Robert Kennedy complaint about GNP. So if you go back to thinking about the early days of GNP, or gross domestic product, gross national product, in the 1940s and 1950s, to compile such a complicated statistic as GDP, it took rooms full of mostly women doing the computations by hand with pencils and paper. So one boundary was about all you could hope for, right? Fortunately, today we have computers that allow us to do data pivots, and what we certainly do not want the same number of boundaries that there are sustainable development indicators and targets. That's far too many for anyone to make sense of. I think we all know that. But a few small boundaries is a really important idea. So there's the boundaries that already exist related to the production boundary of what's already in GDP. And I've shown you that there are a lot of natural assets that would already wind up on the balance sheet there. There's another issue related to a long-running debate. It actually goes back to Simon Kuznets and Keynes had this debate about how to account for what are called defensive expenditures. This is what happens when you lose something and you wind up having this. These are cost savings terms. What happens when you lose something? So Kuznets thought that we should deduct defensive expenditures from national accounts. Keynes wanted to be able to use national accounts to motivate financing World War II, and felt that, well, that would mean not accounting military spending in gross domestic product, and therefore we wound up having sort of these defensive expenditures not deducted. And so the example here from a natural capital standpoint is if you have a forest that is providing, lowering the cost of downstream water treatment facilities, and you liquidate that forest, you cut down that forest, your water treatment facility costs go up, you should be accounting for the cost savings of maintaining that forest in some form of accounting. This is one of the boundaries. Another one is household produced services. These are things households produce for themselves. This is largely associated with work often attributed to women, childcare, cooking and cleaning is sort of the classic examples, but also perhaps producing some home food, also self-produced leisure. So having a few boundaries, a lot of arguments happen around is this in or out, and the right answer is do it both ways. It shouldn't be that much more work with modern computing, and let's have the argument after we know whether the argument is going to change our decisions or change what we're learning from these systems, and then maybe why. This is a flow chart in the US national strategy that I would encourage people to look at that helps you understand these different boundaries. I'm not going to go through all of this in the interest of time so we can hear other people, but I want to read just two of the key bits. So to get into sort of the current production boundary, is capital, labor, or other material inputs used to generate goods and services. Okay, that's not a particularly high bar. And then if you say no to that, and then sort of the right side of this navigates you through sort of the production boundaries. The left side, if you were to say no, there's really two criteria that would still have you inside this current system of national account boundaries for natural capital. They are capital and labor or other materials stored or saved forgoing current use opportunities for potential future goods or services. Examples, wild fish, forests, land, minerals, water, kind of basic natural resources, and here's the key bit, there's some ownership or a governance structure exerting management to generate future goods and services that would be in that production boundary. So the point here is as you develop governance and institutions that can actually steward natural resources, they move from outside the asset boundary to inside the asset boundary, even for the current, going back to 1993, national accounting standards. So let me give you an example of how this works for something that's really important for food security in agriculture. I'm going to talk about groundwater in a minute, but I just wanted, as a professor and an economics professor, I have to have one equation. You guys didn't realize this was an equation. So this is the prettiest equation you will ever see because it's the only time I've ever paid a graphic designer to write an equation for me. So the point here is we need to be able to measure stocks. And what I like to say when we talk about measuring stocks, I say like, I need to be able to describe it in a way I can tell an electrical engineer to build me a sensor for it. I can't talk in abstract terms. I need to know the units. I need to know what I'm measuring. We need to account for the policies and institutions that are governing human behavior and how humans are interacting with that stock. So the same stock in one place, the same cubic meter of water in one place can have a different value than a cubic meter of water in a different place solely because of different institutions and human behaviors. We need to account for how things interact with other stocks. This winds up in a capital gains term. And we need to account for sort of dynamics. So let me give you this example of groundwater in Kansas. This is some work we did, almost a decade ago now. Kansas is a relatively simple system, I admit it. They have a lot of groundwater. They use a lot of groundwater in crop production. This is a heavily agricultural area. They have 5 main row crops. And so we went out and measure how different levels of stored water in the ground influence the crops farmers choose to grow, how much land, what share of their land they bring into production, and how well those crops grow. And we're able to use that in the framework I just showed you in that beautiful equation to compute the implied price, that is how farmers are behaving. They value groundwater in the ground. This is before they lift it up to put it on it, so there's some value add if you pump it to the surface. This is the water stored in the aquifer. And we find they were valuing it at about $7 an acre foot. We're able to, this is not the units people use, and so acre foot for everybody in the room, this is this crazy American unit. It's about 1,200 cubic meters of water. If we thought of this groundwater as a trust fund, which is really what it is, right? It's an asset. It's a liquid asset, that can be converted to other things through production and agriculture. Kansas withdrew about $110 million from its trust fund every year. Now, if you have a trust fund, you can take money out of it and invest it in other things. That's not a crazy thing to do sometimes, but you should keep track of how much you're pulling out, right? That is kind of good just management. So we can compare that then. It turns out this is about equal to the, when we analyze this is about equal to the state's 2005 budget surplus. So, boop, there goes the budget surplus if we actually think of some sort of net accounting. We also see that it turns out that this withdrawal of ground, or this loss of groundwater wealth is greater than the investment in schools. So it would be one thing to say we're using this groundwater wealth and we're converting it into educating our young people. Like, you can debate whether that's a good idea, but that is a really smart, savvy debate that policymakers should be having, right? But we need to know the change in the groundwater value. What was interesting is I got invited out to Kansas in November of 2016. For those of you who follow American politics, you can think of what happened in November of 2016. And so I was late November 16 in western Kansas talking to farmers about the value of groundwater. And we presented our work. I presented our work, and upon seeing it, the farmers basically looked at me and said, "This makes sense, and it means we need to do better groundwater management." Okay, I didn't tell them that. I didn't go there. I wasn't stupid enough to go to western Kansas and tell farmers what they should do with the water there. I wouldn't be here talking to you today if I did. But showing them their data pivoted in a different set of dimensions was really insightful. And a number of the farmers and some of the state legislatures floated the idea, we could take that $17, and if we just charged everyone $17 for every acre foot of water they pumped out, then we'd actually have a regional development fund that we could use in Western Kansas to invest in small businesses, to invest in education. This came from them. I didn't have to go there and tell them that. What I needed to go there and do is sort of pivot their data from a biophysical unit to an economic unit so they could get the water in the same dimensions that they have sort of investing in tractors. Okay, and so we've done this over and over again in contentious, hard resource management settings. And what I always find is I'm amazed by how everyone goes, this is interesting and helpful for having an informed conversation and like lowering the temperature, narrowing what we're talking about, and really focusing in on the core management decision challenges. What I will say is this link here, I use this in my graduate class. And all of the code for reproducing this is there. So if you want to get into the technical details, you can go and do problem set 2 in my graduate class and learn how we do this. What I'm talking about right now, what I've kind of talked about now, is how do you do assessment of sort of social economic progress or welfare or a scorecard even, or maybe even benefit cost analysis. But these national statistics would not survive if that's all they were used for. They're really important for helping us organize the underlying data so we can worry about things like forecasting tax base and budgets, so that we can think about creditworthiness, so we can think about risk, so we can think about regional planning models. So I want to sort of tell you about sort of how you can use these data in both ways. So yes, people are very interested in benefit cost analysis when we're doing project assessment. But it turns out national economic statistics are almost never used in prospective benefit cost analyses. Okay? So for a prospective benefit cost analysis for a project, the question is, what's the future going to look like with and without the project? So we're talking about the future, accounting is about the past. Accounting is about what's actually happening, not some hypothetical. So not the with the project or the, whichever, imagine that like we could start the new project or not. However, maybe the national accounting data, if we organize it correctly, it's useful for creating those baselines. So it's half the problem for a prospective benefit, or half the challenge of a prospective benefit cost analysis. But what national accounts really do is they help us look retrospectively at welfare gains. Because what they're doing when we work in real terms, or what the accountants call volumetric terms, is we're doing the thought experiment that if all of the relative prices were the same last year as this year, are we better off this year? Are we wealthier this year? Did we have more income this year? That's the question. And that's an important question for being able to learn from the past. Because fundamentally, that's what science and evidence is. It's about learning as much as you can from the past to make better decisions in the future, because we can't learn from the future yet. Woo. So let me give you an example of evaluation, and I'll try and, this is Baltic Sea fisheries. We look at 3 fish stocks that all interact with each other. Cod, which is a predator, herring and sprat, which are prey. We use the universe of Polish fishing vessels in their logbooks to understand the structure of the fishery. We use the same framework I showed you a moment ago for groundwater. And what we're able to do is look retrospectively. Our data ended in 2013 when we were doing this. And we're able to look retrospectively. This is this area on the left, to the left of this vertical line. V and IW are 2 ways of measuring the same thing, and part of what we were doing in this figure is showing that they actually approximate each other really well. The change in wealth is the level of wealth indexed to 2013 is the way you can think about these. And what you see is right here, it's fairly stable. Maybe it's going up a little bit, so maybe this fishery actually wasn't unsustainable. And the black lines, what we're showing is when the fishery was managed, you managed cod, you managed herring, you managed sprat, and you did this all independently. You didn't worry about the ecological interactions. But what we show is if you continue that management forward, if we then start projecting those behaviors forward with the response of the fishing fleet, it's actually going to dip down in the future. And so this single species management is not going to continue delivering. It's not going to be awful, but it's not going to deliver new wealth. We're not going to do better. But what we see is a switch to managing those 3 species as an interactive system actually raises wealth by about 1/3, and it continues to grow after 2013. And indeed, this is the policy decision that was taken in 2017 while we were writing this paper. And why is that? Well, think about a firm. If you had a firm that did production, logistics, and marketing and didn't have somebody making sure those different units were talking to each other, it's probably going to do worse than the same firm by quite a bit than that coordination, and that's what's going on here with accounting for these ecological relationships. So that's how we think about assessment. But there's all these other problems or challenges in the policy space where these sorts of statistics are going to be helpful. So I'm going to give you sort of what I think are sort of the top of the hit list here. One is environmentally linked trade policy. We're seeing a growing number of trade policies by individual countries linking to environmental performance. I think CBAM, everybody's heard, is like following CBAM and what's actually going to happen. The EU's also put out their deforestation-free products initiative. The EU and the US have their global arrangement on aluminum and steel tariffs, which links to carbon intensities. There's the treaty on plastic, which has trade implications. And I keep saying I'm going to start a betting pool for when the EU is going to announce its BBAM policy, which is its biodiversity border adjustment. It does not exist, but I'm thinking it's coming, right? If anyone's tracking the way this works. So why is this important? Well, because if you think that these trade policies can actually help enhance environmental sustainability, the only way they're going to work is if we have environmental data linked to economic data, right? So we need them to make these policies successful. These are good ideas and they're actually going to raise all boats. If you are cynical and think these are basically a way to do protectionist trade policy, your best defense is to have good environmental economic statistics to show that you are kind of above the line and you're doing better than at least as well as the Europeans are, because the Europeans are still getting their act together to actually have good environmental economic statistics. And I'm picking on the deforestation-free and CBAM, of course, but this would be true in any case. I think it's also a place where many of the developing member countries here at the ADB can actually play catch-up, because you saw the Philippines, Indonesia, some of the member developing countries are actually kind of ahead of the game. So Norway just I think last year partnered with Indonesia. Norway's paying for the further development of marine accounts, but they're using the Indonesian expertise because Indonesia is actually ahead of Norway on this. Okay, so there are some real opportunities here. I think another place is really thinking about the future of public finance and credit risk, something I think people here kind of care a little bit about. And why is this? Because we're talking about the asset base of countries or other geographies. And we've seen this, the IMF has done this. This is like, I think, a 2018 report from the IMF where they're looking at Kazakhstan. I'm showing you here, this is the black and gold bars. And they're looking at the net operating balance of Kazakhstan. And if you look in the early 2010s, what they're showing is, hey, this has a positive net operating balance as a percent of GDP. But if you start deducting for just mineral drawdown, suddenly it's negative. Right? And you're going to make a very different investment case in sort of investing in Kazakhstan's sort of general debt looking at that. And there's other research that's shown up that sort of natural capital is starting to come into some sovereign debt assessments. And what we're seeing here, even in the US, I'm standing in front of it, the citations. I don't know if you guys can see these. We're starting to see work in the municipal bond markets in the US where we're actually seeing higher spreads for municipalities at higher risk to things like sea level rise, or municipalities that have lower levels of natural capital, controlling for other factors, right? So this isn't going to swamp things, but we are seeing higher borrowing costs for these municipalities. And if it's happening for municipalities, it's probably happening for countries, for counties, countries, states, what have you. We need to start getting our head around this. And this may actually create some opportunities to think about how we can finance nature, because now we see where the cash flows come from ensuring lower borrowing costs and reducing repayment risks on some of this debt. We also need to do better long-range planning. So, one of the issues that I dealt with when I was at the White House and participated in was helping think, how do we deal with climate change in the long-run budget forecast? And what we concluded was it would be really helpful to have a set of environmental economic statistics, because most climate change impacts are going to work their way through natural capital. And so without those statistics, it's hard to build forecasting models for a long-run budget forecast. And so this is just better economic decision making. The other place we see this in the United States is a lot of regional planning models, like the IMPLAN model, these regional input-output models that regional planning authorities use. Many of them now have environmental modules, but they're completely divorced from the economic data that are used. So having a data set that's actually talking about the two things in an interactive way should improve the ability of these models to guide local planning decision making. So let me wrap up so we can hear from some other people and think about what are the key next steps. So I think we need to continue supporting the revision of the system of national accounts, and there's discussion of starting a new process maybe next year on the system of revising again the system of environmental economic accounting to just update it. It's really important to ensure that natural resources and the environment are taken seriously. And this is taken seriously by the national accountants and the economists, but also taken seriously by conservationists and environmentalists. What do I mean by that? Of course they take the natural resources and environment seriously. What it means is being focused, right? If you go to like the COP, everything is a crisis, everything is on fire. And it's really hard to start putting out a fire when everything is a fire, and you need to figure out how to prioritize and do the simple things well, like I showed you the water, okay? We need to develop classification systems, and this is something I think the ADB could be really helpful on, is develop workable classification systems that actually are useful for countries to make decisions on. Not because some ecologist thought this was the way that we should classify ecological production, but because perhaps it actually has the greatest connections with economic decision making already. So maybe we can work backwards from some of the existing economic classification systems. I think we need to start using the valuation techniques that exist carefully, and I've got other work on that, and we can talk about that offline if people are interested. We need to start near market and build capacity, certainly something ADB has a comparative advantage in doing. What I mean by near market, again, is like that groundwater is near market. It's going right into crop production. This is different than some abstract notion of, say, biodiversity, which is like hard to know what the connection to market outcomes are. Like not all environmental assets have the same distance to market. Let's start with the things that are near market, build capacity, learn, disseminate that knowledge, and then we can take on harder challenges. That's how national accounts have evolved over the last 70 years anyway. And then I think another place where the ADB could have a really, at least here in Asia, is get countries to start reporting in a common format and common repository. The blue and green squares I showed you, I can't do that for natural capital without like paying a student for a whole semester to go through all of those links, try and find those links. They're all in different, there's no common reporting tool. Developing that kind of common reporting tool would be really helpful for, enabling analysts to start using the data more constructively because they'll know the data formats and the ontologies to be working on. Okay. I think the other thing that everyone here can do is hold the countries like the US that have made commitments and put out plans, and it's not just the US, it's Australia, it's Canada, it's Indonesia, it's the Philippines, accountable for continuing to develop those and continuing to try and implement those into decision making. I think partnering with groups like NGFS is also a really wise strategy here. And then I think we need to start thinking about how can we pay attention to these balance sheets and changes in non-financial, non-produced assets going forward in financial decision-making. And this is something I think the ADB could really do, would be, say, start doing some envisioning about, let's say these things existed, let's say they were reliable. How would we structure decisions differently? What could we do differently? What is the pull side? What would let you go home an hour earlier because the data were organized in a way that made sense, right? I think putting some of that out would be really helpful here. Here I've got a list of things just to remind people that, one of the challenges environmental economists like me have always done is I feel like my profession really evolved to help the US EPA win lawsuits in benefit cost analysis. And the criteria there was welfare. That's different than financial returns. And so we haven't always produced the right data, and that's sort of on us for the kinds of decisions you all want to make. But when we see bond spreads that are higher in degraded areas, when we see insurance companies writing real insurance policies on coral reefs and forests, when we see tax revenue declining when specific species decline, wild species decline, when we see people willing to take pay cuts to go live places with cleaner air, those are real cash flows that are connected to natural capital. This is not something hypothetical. It is not a warm, fuzzy feeling. There is a real cash flow. The challenge for us is to figure, the problem is the scale and scope where the investment is needed is often different than where the returns are capitalized. And so again, I think the creativity of the folks I've met here at the ADB this week, I'm confident that they can think about how to structure some of those vehicles to actually capture the cash flows on the other side where the investments need to go in somewhere else. I think I should be quiet and we should hear from some of the other great panelists we've got. Thank you.
Okay, that was very inspiring, and I hope you're ready for the next part of our session, which is going to kind of unpack how this might apply in Asia and the Pacific. May I invite our panelists to come to the stage, please? And As Dr. Eli was alluding, ADB actually is really, and as indicated by, really trying to get you to come here to prevent your research, we are really trying to do much more in natural capital development as well as natural capital accounting. And so with us today, let me just switch seats here. Some of the people that are, this is on, right? Yeah, some of the people that are taking a lead role here in ADB to look at how we can actually apply what Professor Eli was advocating. We have Albert Park to my immediate left. He is the chief economist, and he heads a department that we call the Economic Research and Development Impact Department. They actually set all the guidelines for how we assess our projects from an economics lens, as well as how we assess what we do on development impact. Next speaker is Warren Evans. He's our climate guru, special advisor to the president on climate change and taking a lead role in trying to push us more toward greater climate resilience in all that we do. Emma Fan is representing the finance sector. She leads a finance sector group in basically half of our countries, I think. And she's got a lot of practical experience as well. Chinfeng Zhang, you've probably met in other forums because he's actually the one responsible for leading this food security forum. He leads our agriculture, food, nature, and rural development sector. And then Eli will join the panel as well. So what we want to do is spend about, we have about 35 minutes, but we also want to engage you as well. So I'll make sure that there's time at the end to have you ask your own questions. So please think about that. And I want to go kind of back and forth between our speakers to kind of unpack how what we were just learning really applies to us and helps us, encourage our clients, who are our countries and represented by the governments, to do better decision making in light of what we learned today. So I'll start with Chinfeng. Can you please tell us what, from the sector group's perspective, the AFNR sector group, what you're doing to actually promote natural capital accounting or the enhancement of ecosystem services valuation, briefly?
Thank you so much, Cindy, and also congrats Annie for the very comprehensive review about the natural capital accounting. From the ADB perspective, agricultural, food, natural, rural development sector office, together with the Stanford University, and also in term, back in Bangkok, we established sort of a natural capital lab. This lab is basically include three key elements. One is the natural capital accounting. Two is use this accounting to leverage the policy change. So in that way, we can introduce eco-compensation or the payment for ecological services. Finally, uses this metrics. Of course, we can also introduce planet financing. From the MDB perspective, our key goal is introduce a bankable project. This is the first. The second point I want to quickly share is in terms of the natural capital accounting. Of course, this is quite a long history along with the MDB. Again, Warren is my good coach. Actually, he came from the World Bank and also ADB. He's going to discuss about different metrics. This is a focus on a single natural stock, forest, or shared services, and so on and so forth. But today, I want to discuss is a sort of the aggregating indicator. Growth ecosystem product, which is a sort of aggregating indicator to measure the monetize sort of ecosystems as a whole. So this indicator now is widely used, of course, mostly along the Yangtze River, Yellow River. Many of the provinces already adopted. Also help us to scale up our investment along the Yangtze River ecological restoration. They already accumulated $3.7 billion investment. This matrix also widely applied to a number of the countries already, GMS and also Colombia. Finally, I want to just quickly share with you is that with this good progress, ADB, Inter-American Bank, World Bank, together with Stanford, started from last year, we created sort of the global forum for natural capital accounting. So each of the MDB, we selected 5 countries together to compare notes. From the Asia Pacific, basically Sri Lanka, Armenia, Cook Island, Philippines, and also, of course, PRC also included. And then now we make very good progress for Sri Lanka. Again, Cindy is our DDG for South Asia. She know it. So they are right now natural capital upstream system already included the Sri Lanka CPS. Probably let me just pause here.
Yes, please.
And then, other people can also supplement. Thank you so much.
So this is very much what Chengfeng is saying is very much taking several departments at ADB to work on. So from ERDI's perspective, Albert, what do you think how research can really enhance the abilities of ADB to account for natural capital, and how is ERDI supporting this initiative?
Well, specifically on the project that Chengfeng mentioned last, doing 5 projects in 5 countries that use natural capital accounting principles, we're going to support the assessment of the valuation of ecosystem services for 3 of the projects. One is looking at the South Dongting Lake project in China. Another is in the Cook Islands, the services provided by the Murray Lagoon. And then in the Philippines, we have a watershed project in Zambales. And the reason the research department really wants to engage in this is that we're still learning how to do a better job valuing ecosystem services. It's not easy because oftentimes ecosystems are delivering many different types of services. Many of them are not measured. We don't have data. And then some of them, as Eli mentioned in the talk, are hypothetical. We're trying to assess the value ahead of time if we want to go ahead and do projects. And so we need to understand hypothetically what would happen. Now, sometimes there are ways, opportunities in research where you can look at how, for instance, building a new park changes the land prices, and you can get an implicit value of how it's changing, that the economic value is being changed by these services. But other times, you may just have to ask people in the area, how much would you value this if this hypothetical situation occurred? But even then, there's problems because, they may be thinking about different things that would accompany this hypothetical. So how do you even explain a hypothetical? And there are a lot of methodological issues related to that we want to understand and really start to develop practices that are doing better. And Martino here from our department is also leading an effort to create a tool that can actually use a benefit transfer kind of method to say, okay, we may not have that much data on the ecosystem services values in this project in this area, but there's been a lot of studies of similar projects. There have been a lot of studies in the local area, and how can we use all of that information to help inform the assumptions we make about the services for this project, taking into account, how good do we think that study was done, what is the quality of those estimates, and what is the relevance, whether it be distance or type of project or other contextual factors. So that's part of the agenda.
That sounds really fascinating. Do you anticipate, Albert, wait, I have a follow-on question. Do you anticipate that this will, once you really delve deeper in experimenting on these tools, do you anticipate changing our guidelines for how we do economic assessment of projects?
Maybe. I mean, really, it's just getting better numbers that are more evidence-based on what we think the return. We already tried to assess these returns. And by the way, many projects that ADB does already has ecosystem services. That's not new, but trying to think about raising the profile, working with the Stanford group also, who are really good at modeling the technical assumptions that underlie the ecosystems, but then bringing the economic side, I think that will bring it together. One aspect, I think, which is important, which Eli also noted, is that, if we think about the natural capital framework and we think about tracking the project benefits, not just ex ante, but then through to ex post, we really do need to account for how the project is affecting the capital stock, the natural capital stock, which often gets neglected. So I think that would be a useful way to apply this framework to thinking more carefully and more accurately about the effects of our projects.
Okay, good. So the other area that we're trying to really think more carefully and accurately is how we measure the impact that we're having on climate, on building climate resilience, and on being able to mitigate GHG emissions, et cetera. So Warren, how does this apply when we look at our climate framework, given that we want to really boost the amount of climate finance that we're doing and impact of climate in our projects?
Okay, thanks. First, I want to thank Eli for using Kansas as his example. As a Kansan, I grew up in the middle of the wheat fields in the middle of Kansas and watched when I was a kid, the first central pivot irrigation systems came in, very nice, cheap, shallow wells. Before I graduated from high school, they were on their third drilling to take it down deeper. And if you go to western Kansas now, there aren't any central pivot systems anymore because they can't afford to drill deep enough. So thanks for using that example. And they wouldn't have shot you. But to answer your question, I'm going to use an example, and the original question I had said, is this going to drive? And I think what it will do is guide. It's not going to drive. My experience is, I remember when Kirk Hamilton, when I was in the World Bank, who sadly passed away a couple of months ago, wrote the first Where's the Wealth of Nations? And if you haven't read that, you should read it. It's really good. And there's been a series of these publications. They haven't driven the World Bank since 2005 to change how it does economic analysis of projects, and certainly not countries. So there's a lot more that needs to be done in a different way to actually impact on how we do work, and I think that what you guys are doing on the Natural Capital Lab is a great idea. To answer your question, I'm going to use an example. Cambodia came to ADB and asked for a fisheries project. When the team started developing the project, they found out, well, gosh, there aren't any fish out there to catch because the ecosystems have been wiped out. The seagrass beds, the mangroves, the ecosystems that produce the fisheries, the shellfish, the bivalves, don't produce anymore. And so it was turned into really an ecosystem restoration, regeneration, conservation, and sustainable fisheries and mariculture project for the entire coastline of Cambodia, not one little space, but the entire coastline. That in terms of the co-benefits, and that's really a lousy word, the multiple benefits of making that investment for climate resilience, for sequestration of carbon, for biodiversity, jobs, and economy are massive. Do they know did they quantify that based on statistics? No way. But we can now. We can actually start counting how much carbon is going to be sequestered. We can predict the fish catches and the yields because there's enough groundwork done. So those are the kinds of things that I think that the understanding of ecosystem services and the need to value those, and then hopefully to build them into accounting systems, will drive much of what ADB does in the future because climate change is going to change so much the productivity of degraded areas as well as productive ecosystems. And so if we don't start building this into our planning and how we make investments at scale, which is the critical two words for me, at scale, then what we invest in is not going to work. So why would we invest in it? So I think that this is really fundamental to the future work of ADB. And if we get it right, that $100 billion is going to be so low compared to what you guys actually deliver by 2030. I'm going to come back and see what you've done. But that's where I see it coming. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for highlighting the upstream planning and how we must actually do this kind of analysis in order to get at the right planning. Because as you say, our clients come to us with maybe their idea of their project, but it doesn't have necessarily the basis to convince a planning department or a Ministry of Finance that that's the priority investment. So I think Eli's presentation was really getting at, you know, how you can actually use these tools to make the right decisions and to convince the policymakers to make those decisions. Emma, you've thought a lot about partnerships. We've been talking more about government and kind of traditional ways to make decisions. But there are many other players out there besides just your standard public sector. So how do you think ADB can enhance partnerships with other players, including financial institutions, to support projects that promote natural capital and adopt ecosystem-based approaches? And a follow-on question is, you know, could a stronger emphasis on natural capital accounting and ecosystem services valuation actually facilitate getting more of those players in the game?
Thank you, Cindy, for the wonderful questions. 44 trillion of the global GDP is at risk because of deteriorating conditions of nature and biodiversity. That's about 50% of the global GDP. And the finance needed to pause, reverse, and restore nature is also measured at trillions. So public finance alone definitely is not sufficient, and we need to mobilize private sector finance, including through financial institutions. I think that we can do many things, and we are doing many things, and there are many more things we can do. The first one is strong advocacy. And we all say that when there's a will, there's a way. And we need stronger willingness and commitments from the governments and all of us. The second one is what constitutes nature-positive investment? How do we do that? ADB can also showcase the way to support nature-positive investment. We actually have over 10 billion, right? A pipeline, ongoing operations already, but we need more when we compare to trillions of dollars required. Many of such operations are also in Qingfeng's shop, and they need to be expanded to all other sectors as well, including the more difficult sectors as well. And then the third one thing the private sector, including financial institutions, often tell us is where is the cash flow? Where is the financial return? These are fantastic, wonderful investment for the society, but how can I safeguard my bottom line? So for that reason, we really need to support the creation of revenue-generating mechanisms, including policies and so on, such as through land value capturing that can benefit the private sector. The other thing is the de-risking catalytic fund to blend in the market-based finance, reduce cost of capital is essential. Whoever we talk with, including local governments, they need some encouragement to push this forward. And I think the next thing is really about innovative financing instruments. Many things have emerged, and for example, green bonds. In our region, China is the second largest issuer after the US. And how can we make sure that's credible, that it's not suffering from greenwashing risks? Some other instruments, such as nature-based debt for nature swaps, sustainability-linked bonds, biodiversity credit, are at the nascent stage and need strong push and support. Finally, coming to the measurement, you know, we also say what gets measured gets done. If we don't have a good accounting system, many of the loss or benefits that are entailed by the nature will not be known by anybody. And without that, we cannot integrate and mainstream the considerations in our planning investment. We cannot monitor what's happening in the nature. It's very difficult to integrate the nature considerations into the conventional GDP national accounts, but we must do it. Thank you.
So what would be the result of actually being able to mobilize more finance, possibly cheaper finance, to our clients if we did this, Emma? Do you think that we can really unlock more? Maybe Warren wants to also tackle that.
Absolutely. I'm seeing this from first-hand experience because we went to the market, we went to the local, to talk with the local governments, central governments. They're saying we are willing to invest, but I have 100 other investment needs and demands. How do I, even when we have champions, they need something to help them to get through their system. For example, if we want to invest $500 million, even a $5 million grant can make a huge difference by tipping the decision-making process.
Great, and also blending with our normal capital. Warren, did you want to say anything more about that?
I would just, you know, this is a very perverse observation, but the best thing that's happened for biodiversity is climate change because of the funding that's going into climate change. And so the reality is these things are just absolutely connected. And I think we're finally figuring out how to actually optimize the use of climate-targeted grant and concessional finance to actually maximize benefits for ecosystem services, ecosystem health, populations that rely on that, and so on. And the more we understand the climate resilience challenges, the adaptation challenges that are linked to the health of the ability of ecosystems to service, the more capital we'll be able to get, grant and concessional capital. And that's the capital that's going to unlock the private capital.
Exactly.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one point on financing. We've been doing also a lot of work on studying carbon market development in the region. And carbon offsets, you know, for projects that really regulate climate carbon emissions, if that can be documented convincingly, then you can actually finance it through carbon offset markets, which are still, you know, developing, but I think are expected to increase pretty fast in the coming years.
Here is along with this electro capital lab, we also established this Asia Pacific Electro Capital Fund. Got some support from the Global Environmental Facility. Now is the Global Agricultural Food Security Program was agreed to provide the $15 million on top of it. So again, this is a brand financing. But again, one more important is to change the government regulatory policy for the payment for ecological services, mobilize the domestic resources as well. Let me just pause here. Thank you.
Okay, really good point. Also mobilizing domestic. And okay, so I want to go to our floor quickly, and we can come back with any other comments that anybody else wants to make. But are there any other questions from the floor, either through the chat or at the standing mic? Don't be shy. Please, go ahead. Introduce yourself, please.
My name is Dale Rahut. I'm from ADBI, Tokyo, Japan. Actually, my question is to all of you. As you know, you have highlighted so many changes that you have brought in ADB to tackle natural capital. But my question is, since there are a number of projects that you have launched over a couple of, last 50 years or so, so is there any assessment as to what impact ADB's funding had on the natural resource and biodiversity conservation? So that's my question.
That's challenging. So results, Chinfeng.
I think two mechanisms here. Number one, of course, each of the projects we have ID variation ourselves also do the PCR. That is the one mechanism. But sometimes it's a sort of the sector assessment, rather for the next stage here, together with our OP5 evaluation, rural development food security, AED also going to launch the assessment on this electro capital investment as well. But of course, I think ERDI, they can do more for this upstream impact assessment and also the post-impact assessment as well. I'm pause here.
So Martino and other people in our group checked past ADB projects over, I think, an 8-year period, 2015 to 2023, and found about 8 projects a year included the evaluation of ecosystem services. I don't know, you know, to what extent those were then followed up and verified, but we haven't added up the total value, but that gives you a sense that, this has been happening in ADB projects.
Can I just, let's be honest, ADB is its own worst enemy when it comes to telling the world what we're doing. And it's amazing what you find when you drill down to what we're doing, but we do an awful job of bringing that all together to tell a cohesive story. I think that, again, I think climate change has driven us to change that narrative, and it is improving, but certainly it's a key area for us to focus on, and this links to the question of whether we're going to have an impact from your lab and so on. If we don't get the storytelling right, the communications right, how are we going to convince a government to actually change how they make decisions on what they invest in? They won't. So it's a great question and critical that ADB gets this right.
Yes, and as you were saying before, the concessional finance and grants are incredibly scarce. So governments tend to initially say, well, I'll invest in natural capital only if you give me the incredibly concessional finance or even a grant. But where we can demonstrate that this makes really good economic sense for them, then I think we could do a better job in convincing them in our policy dialogue. Who's next? Oh, Eli, go ahead. And please step forward to the mic for the next one.
I just want to add one thing to what you, it's not just convincing them that natural capital or addressing climate change is important. It's like not leaving it out altogether, because we have I don't know if ADB has had projects, but I have seen projects where, yes, there's funding, and the co-financing is actually drawing down natural capital or creating more, the opposite of climate resilience, more climate exposure, right? So that's the implicit co-financing that's been happening for 100 years.
Thank you.
Hi, good morning. Very amazing session. I'm Neil Ian from, I'm affiliated with the International Biochar Initiative in New York, so member of the advisory committee. So this question will go to Professor Eli. So I was thinking, what are your thoughts on the soil food web and regeneration of water, and what it can do to the economy of Asia as a whole? So thank you.
Yes, soil is a very important natural resource. Soil is its own complicated system. There's a lot of variation among soils. But there's certainly opportunities to invest in the elements of soils that lead to productivity, whether it's soil organic matter, biochars and soil amendments. And we're seeing private sector interest in this as well. This is not purely yes, people talk about, there's two elements of this problem that are often confounded. One is soils can sequester carbon and store carbon and be a part of a climate solution. But they also improve productivity on the other end. And so the question is, can we make sure that farmers, landowners, are secure enough in their property rights, secure enough in their investments, that they can at least capture the productivity increases from the soil amendments that they're adopting? And I think this is one of the challenges, is we often say this is all purely an environmental failure, an environmental market failure. It's like, oh, the carbon, we're not paying for carbon. Yeah, but landowners in a lot of countries are at too much risk to even capture the productivity, the private productivity benefits. So I think thinking about those two things together are actually really important, and that's another way of sort of forming new kinds of partnerships.
Please.
Hi, I'm Alex Timbol. I'm an economist, and I have a consulting practice. This was a question that I thought about earlier during the previous session about measurement, because some of the statistics, like in that example, farm mechanization, they were using statistics that are based on ICE engines, diesel engines, horsepower per hectare. And there's also a move to electrify farm equipment because it's cleaner, and obviously solar power can be found everywhere, where diesel in some rural areas is hard to find. So you have these outdated data collection models, which are actually hindering moving towards more sustainable technologies. We've seen this before with landlines and cell phones. You know, more cell phones statistically becomes lower landlines. You know, so I'd like to hear your comments on that.
I think this is actually, this is sort of like the sleeper problem, right, that you've just raised, which is that we need to think about setting out classification taxonomy systems for measuring these things that we know will evolve over time, we know will expand over time, we know will get more granular over time, that higher granularity spatially, higher granularity in sort of product type, right? So one of the really funny things, if you look at part of that SEA system, the System of Environmental Economic Accounting, their central framework on environmental goods and services, one of the things they call an environmental good are electric cars, right? Why? Because they established this before Tesla was even like a figment of anyone's imagination, right? And now it's absurd, at least where I live, it's like absurd to think of an electric car as primarily an environmental good. It might have less emissions than an ICE, but like people are buying them because they're nice cars and they get them from point A to point B. The initial classification schemes were not as thoughtful as it probably needed to be, but that's what happens the first time you do something, and you iterate and you adapt. I think we need a lot more careful thinking again about not just let's sit down and brainstorm all the types of innovations, but how do they actually relate to the economic problems we're trying to solve? How do they relate to the financing decisions? How do they relate to the taxation decisions? How do they relate to these sorts of issues? I think that's a really important innovation, and I think it is something that the folks here at ADB and elsewhere could really contribute to. And they don't need a ton of external buy-in. They need to say, this looks helpful for us, we're going to pilot it, and I think they can pull Eurostat, they can pull the statistical community along, because if you read the statistical guidelines, there's a sentence in there that tells me you guys can do this. This is about household produced services, and they say household produced services are really economically important. There's huge economic value. However, if we actually include them in the system of national accounts, they're so important that they'll swamp information about de-equilibrium macroeconomic conditions like inflation and not be useful for monetary policy, right? And so the point is actually, to the extent that these are useful for monetary policy, to the extent that these are useful for thinking about like the fiscal management of countries, we need to get the taxonomies, the classification schemes right that can align with those decisions. And you all are in a really good position to help guide that conversation going forward.
Coming back to my original questions, actually, you see, like Alex also pointed out, and Warren, you have also pointed out, like if you look at like Tonle Sap Lake, you have almost depleted the fisheries. There's no fish, right? And the damage that we have done, as Eli has also said, that the soil is like we have really degraded the quality of soil, right? And if you look at the water resources, we have really depleted it. The water table has gone so down. The forests, the biodiversity, we have damaged so much. But the ADBI projects that's coming in looks at like, you know, whether we have the environmental, natural resource, ecology component or not. But is there any effort, although it's not the responsibility of ADB, but is there any effort to see how we can reverse the damage that we have done? Because if we don't reverse the damage that we have done until now, we can have a very catastrophic impact on the next generation. So is there any policies or program that really looks into those kind of things?
Go ahead, Warren.
Ching-Peng, you also. Now, I think that if you look at the pipeline that we've got right now, a large part of that is specifically to restore, regenerate, conserve the natural resource base that countries are relying on, and taking into account future impacts of climate change on those exact same resources. I think a challenge that we've got when you look at this from an accounting point of view, because accounts look backwards, the climate change impacts are in front of us. And so the values in, the Cambodia project I was talking about, if we restore all the seagrass and we restore all the mangroves and we get good fisheries management programs in, there's still going to be a loss of fisheries because of ocean heating and acidification. So we have to start building in the future, and I think that's what we're doing now. I see a dramatic change in the ADB, the amount of upstream analytical work on risks, the building that into country programs, bringing private and sovereign, non-sovereign together into strategic planning. That's all happening as we speak. It's got to happen faster and bigger to even keep up with the problems that we've got. But it is happening. So yeah, I think that the restoration of ecosystems and all the other things I was talking about has become a very large part of ADB's pipeline.
Chin-Feng, you want to supplement?
Very quickly to the supplement, you have a very good point. Again, from the ADB end, if you look at our pipeline, we very much focus on conservation and also restoration. But more importantly, need to stop those behavior or the actions for the ecosystem degradations. So again, I introduced some regulatory and also the decree from the government side is quite essential. I think we make some progress from the ADB end. One is, of course, in PRC, another is Vietnam. Again, PRC, when we work on this ecological civilizations concept from the 2013, the sort of the performance review, the government will really say, when your local officials want to leave your office, let's have the natural capital assessment, and you are accountable for result. So that type of the change really prevent the future degradation. Vietnam also have this forest payment decree, also introduces if your hydropower have the effect on the biodiversity or ecosystem, you need to pay for it. You need to set aside the sort of premium to support the eco services protection. Let me just pause here. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we have one last question that's coming from online. And Eli, this will go first to you, and then maybe Albert can supplement. This is from Lan Lei. She's an environmental economist in our ag sector group. Multiple GDP equivalent indicators for environment were proposed decades ago, but never had much attention and merged into official national statistics. Are you positive that with the current national capital accounting mechanism that we'll actually finally adopt, that the countries will adopt these, like GDP?
So I think,
And
so,
why?
so I want to actually start by answering a little bit of what building on the conversation that was just happening, that the future is tomorrow's past. And the reason that GDP and international statistics are helpful is because they help us learn from the past, right? And that's what science and evidence really does, right? So putting the mechanisms in place to learn from the past, to learn from tomorrow's past now, is like the ultimate sort of forethought of actually having evidence. So what does this mean? So what happened in the 1970s, so there's a couple issues. One is there are never-ending debates about expanding the boundary of GDP and what is in that production boundary, what's in, what's out, what's classified as capital. You know what? This has changed a lot over the last 70 years. People don't really, it hasn't changed this name GDP. But for example, in the US, around 2012, I think it was, so artistic originals became capital. Star Wars became a capital asset. That was what, like they used Star Wars as the example, right? And so these things have changed slowly. But I think we also understand that GDP has specific uses most closely related to things like short-term fiscal forecasting, right? Right now, with climate, one of the big pushes is how do we do longer-term financial forecasting? And there's more and more emphasis on looking at the balance sheet. That balance sheet is sitting there, and it's anemic in most countries. It's supposed to be a double-entry accounting system, but it's actually, if a firm came to you, if a private company came to you with just a gross revenue statement, you probably wouldn't make a loan. You'd probably say, can you show us at least like a balance sheet as well? Like, what do you guys own? What are your capital assets? We don't do that with countries. We tend not to we tend to pretend that countries aren't going concerns when we make these loans, right? Like when we do financing at the national level, even at the state level in the U.S. But I think what's happening now is a realization that we need not to change GDP, but GDP, like, it's like trying to fly an airplane and all you're looking at is the speedometer. You might want an altimeter as well in there. And I think it's trying to get a few, and the challenge for all of us in the international community is to find a few, emphasizing a few good summary statistics, because what we tend, and part of the reason GDP has survived the way it is every time we have these conversations in like the UN space, is every person who shows up to the meeting walks away with 2 indicators. Right? And that's not helpful either.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, we need to close this and let you get to a lunch break. So this has been an incredibly, I think, enriching panel discussion, and Dr. Eli kicked it off with his reporting of the research, how the science has actually advanced, how the methods and tools are there, how we are seeing more global commitment with the U.S. and others that are actually very much committed to building the tools and methods that, and we also are learning that some of our countries are leapfrogging that, or they can really do that, and that's really our goal within ADB to help them do that. We're already doing a lot of this assessment for ecosystem services and in our economic analysis in our projects now. It may not be as systematic as it should be. We may not have aggregated the results, and more importantly, we probably need to do a whole lot better job in communicating the results and rolling them into the future decisions that we're helping our clients make. Collaboration is really the next step. We have joined forces with Stanford University's National Capital Project to help actually strengthen the capacity of our developing member countries on national capital accounting and assessments. And we're also building our own natural capital lab here at ADB, which is aimed at introducing innovative business models and science-based valuation methods. And this virtual lab that I hope that you all will stay a part of will host a variety of knowledge, methods, and best practices for using and restoring natural capital across Asia and the Pacific. So I hope that this is a first stage of conversation with you at future forums, but through this virtual lab, you will be engaged with us. You will hold us accountable for what we're committing to, and we'll all together be able to see better results. Thank you.